So Michelle High, our managing editor at American Purpose, thank you for gathering and admitting us into the room now. I'm Jeff Gedman with American Purpose. Welcome to everybody. I often, and in particular today, feel, as they say, like a kid in a candy store. This is a treat to have Francine Stock, a writer, a film critic, a BBC broadcaster, moderate a conversation with David Thomson, who is even, dare I say, becoming a bit of a regular with American Purpose, a leading film historian, film critic, and a fabulous writer. Francine may do the same in a moment, but I'm going to hold up David's new book, and if you can see it on screen, it's called Disaster, Mon Amour, and David, it's marvelous. I felt in reading it like one feels when you're binge watching series, on Netflix or Amazon. You get to the end so quickly, it's such a delight, and then I want to know where the next one is. So you'll tell us where the next one is and when it comes. You're prolific, but welcome to everybody. A word about format. Francine's going to lead the conversation, and then at a certain point we'll have Q&A, questions from the gallery, and I'm happy to facilitate that part. Francine will become a co-panelist, as it were, and answer questions with David. And we have a partner today, Luke Phillips of Braver Angels. Luke, I'm going to give you the floor for about 32 seconds, and here goes. But first, Sydney Lipset, my colleague, editor, Arts and Culture, American Purpose, said, thank you. It was your vision. You curated and designed this, and it's thanks to you that we have this lovely conversation upcoming. Luke, thanks for the partnership. Who are you? What is Braver Angels? You have 32 seconds.
Thank you, Jeff. Well, all Braver Angels members attending this, thank you for joining us today, and I highly recommend you take a look at American Purpose and join their mailing list. They do some excellent work. Everybody else, Braver Angels is a bipartisan, grassroots-led civic organization working to bring Americans together across our multitudinous political and cultural divides. And among other things, workshops and debates, we also host the Braver Angels Film Club. And so this event is being partnered with American Purpose through the Braver Angels Film Club, which does conversations among Braver Angels memberships on various classic films. So it is a great honor to be working with Jeff Gedman and Sid Lipset and our wonderful speakers today on a discussion that will be covering themes relevant to questions of the history and the art of film and what that means for high culture in America and the world more broadly. Jeff, I'm really glad that you guys reached out to us to work on this, and I look forward to many more soon.
So Luke, thank you. David, welcome. Francine, welcome. Francine, it's your show.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you to you and Sydney for and American Purpose for allowing me to be here to talk to one of my most favorite writers, a man who led me into various areas of film without us ever having spoken for years and years and years. And then it's been my great pleasure to be able to talk to him a little bit more recently as well. So we are here to talk about Disaster, Mon Amour, his fascinating and, as you can see, beautifully covered book, as we saw, with a really beautiful, beautiful image, which seems entirely suitable because the terrible beauty of images is one of the things that runs through it. So David, I want to start though by asking you that disasters, obviously, when we think of disasters, immediately we are thinking of the last 2 years, the period since the spring of 2020 and the global pandemic. And indeed, much of this book refers to events of that. It weaves its way through it. But for how long, David Thomson, have you been obsessed with disaster?
Well, I don't know about obsessed, but I've lived with it, I suppose. I was born and brought up in a house in South London, and I was not aware of it at the time, but my parents explained to me after the war that, in fact, the house had been hit 3 times by bombs, not with devastation. And I didn't notice any of it, but I did realize that the attic was charred and burned out, and that there was a part of the house that would have to be chopped off. And you know, you're not old enough to know, but the years after the war, which is about when I began to notice anything and feel it, were very tough in Britain. And it was a joke that people told a lot, that they sort of wished they had lost the war, because the countries that lost the war were being supported by America principally and given a lot of funding. We had food rationing into the 1950s, and it was a very impoverished country. And the feeling of the impact of the war was extraordinary, and a key moment in my life, and I didn't recognize it as disaster immediately, but my granny every day would go through the newspaper with me. And one day there was this picture on the front page of very thin, very drawn, desperate people wearing what I thought were pajamas. And it was a picture of a concentration camp that had just been liberated. Obviously, I didn't know what that entailed, what that meant. But as I came to understand it better, often by seeing films, Night and Fog, for instance, it just occurred to me, obviously not to me alone, but that the war was never going to end in a funny way. And the implications and the repercussions of the war were there forever. A quite appalling aspect of human nature had been spelled out all over Europe, all over the world, but very much so in Europe. And having won the war, it was better than losing it, I suppose, but it did not seem really to have an impact on the message that was there, that human nature was not as kind, not as benevolent as our schooling tried to teach us it was. And of course, today, we are still in that same crux. And if the invasion was launched during the show, we would probably carry on because we're well trained in those kind of things. But we're in a kind of ongoing hell. And it's not as if that's the only part of it. Even if people were much kinder to one another than they are, or much wiser, the water level is still rising. In the west of America, we have this dual threat. We have immense drought, and we have the possibility that cities, habitation on the shore quite soon is going to come under real threat. So, you know, it's a long-winded way of answering your question, but I think the disaster has always been there. And I dare say that previous generations and centuries felt the same. What's so true now is that we can't avoid it. My grandparents didn't really know what was going on in the world because there was not the kind of media coverage that there is now. We know what's going on and we can't avoid it. And every morning we hit our phone to see what's happened. And the disasters range from the situation in Ukraine and poor Miss Valieva falling over on the ice 4 or 5 times. Someone who I suspect had no knowledge of what drugs she might have taken because they were pushed into her by her controllers. She's an athlete of a totalitarian state, and she's 15. Well, we've all been 15, and some of us have had 15-year-olds, and you know, the pressure that she was under is quite appalling. And the two disasters, if you like, are sort of, they're on the phone in the same place at the same level. Part of what is so extraordinary about disaster is it is an element of entertainment for us all now.
Yeah.
Anyway, I've
I
answered your question too lengthily.
No, but it is precisely, no, you've come to a sort of perfect juncture in that respect, because although this is, although film is to be found everywhere in this book, it's also, I think you are also dealing with our reaction or our depiction of reality and our reaction to what we see depicted as reality, which is ubiquitous, obviously, now in a way that no other generation has had to deal with in quite the same way.
Absolutely, yeah. And it changes year by year. The incident that really made me think to do this book, in 2015, a movie opened everywhere in the world called San Andreas. I went to see it in one of those big theaters where mainstream films used to play. We don't really have those places anymore, or they're not operating. And it was a packed audience because San Franciscans came out in high numbers to watch a film which climaxed really in the near complete destruction of San Francisco, done through computer-generated imagery. And it's a very silly film in terms of the emotional story it tells. It's an absolute knockout in terms of the special effects. It made a fortune. And I was sitting there in a packed theater watching it. And when the Golden Gate Bridge, which is a very precious thing for people who live out here, turned into sort of pink spaghetti in a most beautiful way, the crowd cheered and roared with laughter, and there was a feeling of glee and pride in it. And every one of those people knew, more or less, that a tremor could go through the theater any moment. Most of the people who were in that theater that day probably were here in 1989. I was here, my wife was here, our 12-day-old son was here, when we had a 6.9, which is sort of chicken feed in terms of earthquakes, but it was terrifying and mind-altering in remarkable ways. And I just felt that there was a perfect metaphor for a culture that wants to be rational, humane, progressive, liberal, all those good things, and is sitting there laughing their heads off at a depiction of a disaster that could happen any second. We're all in that situation now today. And I think more or less since 1945, we all have been. It's been a possibility. And for a long time, people were terrified by the possibility. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 was a really terrifying thing. I think people are almost blasé now about Ukraine. And the kind of things human beings will get used to is just mind-boggling.
I wonder whether you think there's any significance in the fact that San Andreas was made as recently as it was, or because there are cycles of disaster movies, and the 70s obviously particularly, and we think of sort of, Poseidons and Towering Infernos and all those kind of things. Is there a reason? Is there any kind of correlation that you can see?
I think what prompts those films more than anything is some genius in the special effects area coming to a producer or a studio, someone, and saying, look, I found a way we could destroy the Golden Gate Bridge. We've got the technology, and this is a society internationally where if you have the technology, you use it. And I think that many of these disaster films are not prompted by someone saying, we could tell a story about these people in the San Andreas area. It's because computer generation has found a way to do something new. And in so many ways, our society is absolutely determined by the new inventions. The only way we're going to get out of global warming is a series of incredible new inventions. The only, well, one of the reasons why we're in the situation we're in now is the technology that means the iPhone and the internet. You know, and 1984, nobody really could conceive of those things. And it's absolutely clear that they have changed the way people behave and think. And we're a little less humane because of it, although we're much more sophisticated in terms of being in touch with each other.
But I suppose one of the things that you seem to be concerned about, and we're probably all concerned about insofar as we're aware of it, is that actually this depiction of disasters, this constant discussion of imminent disaster actually brings on a kind of, if not apathy, a kind of inertia that we feel that we can do nothing to stop it. And so, like cinema audiences, we just sit and watch without doing anything.
Absolutely. And, you know, that is a huge cultural impact caused by the movies. If you go back before, say, 1890, you can think of innumerable appalling situations in life, like a child being threatened by a tiger, let's say. And if you saw a child being threatened by a tiger, if you can imagine that situation, even if you knew you were risking your own life, you would try, I think most people would, they would try to fight the tiger to save the child. Within just a few years, you were into a form of entertainment, a form of art, form of business, where you could depict a tiger attacking a child, and you sat back and you thought, oh, let's see what happens. How does that work when a tiger attacks a child? Now, in the early days of film, the films were very cautious and very tactful about that degree of violence. That tact has fallen away. And we are used now to seeing things that are unthinkable and appalling. And we are protected by the fact that we can do nothing about it, because that is the circumstance of viewing. You're safe in the dark. When Norman Bates appears out behind the plastic curtain with a knife upraised in Psycho, you don't leap forward to save Janet Leigh. You watch what happens. Now, that sounds very small and very casual. I think it's had a huge effect on the way people respond to virtually everything in life. And it seems to me that we are deep into a culture where the best of us, like us, know what's happening to the world, even if you just confine that to global warming. And we know that the people in charge, the people we may have voted to be in charge, or the people who just took control, don't know what to do about it. So we have made a kind of secret pact with ourselves. And I've done it. I think we've all done it, where you say, well, I'm going to make the best deal I can with what I've got and holding on to it. And I'm going to try to live on the high ground. I may get a gun, and a lot of people are getting guns, because I can see the troubles that are coming. And I know it can't really be dealt with. That's an appalling enlargement of that condition I'm talking about that is inherent in all cinema, that you're safe and terrible things are happening in the picture. This is not cheerful stuff, I know.
But there is another aspect, I suppose, which is no more cheerful, unfortunately, which is that, and you talk about Donald Trump quite a lot, which is also this idea that you can destroy things because you will build back and build better. And that is nearly always, as you point out so shrewdly, in these disaster films, the kind of final sequence, isn't it? That people survey the complete chaos and say, you know,
Now we rebuild.
Now we rebuild.
Yes.
Exactly. Now,
Yes.
this is a kind of fantasy. I mean, you could argue it's a fantasy that goes back through some religious beliefs as well. That's a sort of end of days kind of, you know, and then things will get better. But do you think that that fantasy is still inside us?
Yes, and I think one of the things that keeps it going is there's another trap in all of this that I haven't spelled out yet, which is that most of us, most people in the world, have children and grandchildren. My wife and I have a son who's getting married this summer. I hope they will have children quite soon. On the other hand, if they were to come to me and say, Dad, I just read your disaster book, and do you really think we should have a kid? The reasons why you should not have a kid are so many and so obvious and so irrefutable in a way. And yet they will have a kid, I hope. And people are still having kids, although not in the same number that used to be the case. But as you get close to your own death, you do wonder, at least I do, what will happen? I have 5 children, 3 grandchildren, and I think they're all adorable and wonderful, but I wonder what the hell is going to happen to them. And I won't be there to put up even the feeblest gesture of being able to do anything for them. And I think that's something that everybody on earth is feeling and getting over. And you're putting on a brave face for those younger generations. And they expect it, and we expect it, and it's another kind of contract we have. And, you know, it's why even in the concentration camps, people fell in love and told jokes and wrote books sometimes and did everything they could to make the best of it. And it's one of our greatest assets and qualities that we try to make the best of it. And even in a terrible situation, we'll crack a joke. And even in disaster, there is a lot of humor. I talk in the book about a Laurel and Hardy film, a short film, which is one disaster after another. And it's one of the sweetest, funniest films ever made. And we laugh at people's misfortunes if they're on this screen.
Yeah. Well, and at the risk of trying to find, you know, happy elements in all this, I mean, I did think as I was reading your book, I kept thinking all the time about, okay, so we are contemplating disaster on a scale that nobody has ever done before. And yet artists throughout time have wanted to contemplate disaster. I mean, it is one of the most fertile strains of artistic. If you go back, you know, to Sophocles was not against a bit of disaster.
Right.
If you think about, the Virgil and the Aeneid and Dido and the ghastly death and the fall of Carthage. If you think about Dante and the Inferno, the best bits are always the depiction of the really, really terrible things. And artists, for example, like John Martin, you know, visions of, say, Pandemonium or the fall of Herculaneum. These are things that have inspired Ridley Scott and Scorsese. And, you know, so in a sense, they are feeding off a very sort of a long vein of people contemplating the very worst and finding something kind of exhilarating in it as well.
Absolutely. And, you know, there is extraordinary energy in it. Most of us have as one of our most precious items a car. And, you know, we've all probably been in situations where our car got dinged in some small conflict on the roads. And it's appalling feeling, horrible feeling. And you have to go through all the motions of insurance, but you realize that your car is a part of you, and a scratch in that wonderful steel surface goes to your own soul. But from the time movies began, the movie makers realized that car crashes were wonderfully entertaining because they released that kind of anxiety that we all feel about a precious, expensive vehicle. And, you know, the Keystone Cop films and many of the very earliest films are about car chases and cars going over cliffs and all that kind of thing, because there is, as you say, there's a real exhilaration to it. And that was there in that audience I was talking about watching San Andreas. They were having a ball. And it was insane that they were having a ball about this story in their own city, but nothing would stop them. And the film made like $500 million. The film, by the way, was co-produced by Stephen Mnuchin, who, as some of you may remember, was Secretary of the Treasury. I think that's a nice irony.
So, okay, so it's part of a kind of continuing sort of tradition, but there is, I mean, I suppose what specifically now do you think, if you know, you're worried about the kind of passivity that may be induced by this? Are we at some kind of juncture, do you think, where we could, where we need to be aware that there is a, if you like, a therapeutic use of regarding disaster, but also dangers too?
Well, I mean, I think that we're at a point where a lot of people imagine the breakdown of order and how they would handle life. I talk in the book about Cormac McCarthy's novel, The Road, which is one of the best apocalyptic novels. There are a lot of competition, but it's a beautifully written book. And it's really just about a father and his son who are walking in devastated country trying to survive. And it's a world now without authority. It's not a world where you're suddenly going to realize that in Washington, D.C., someone is pulling everything together again and getting it organized, or in Beijing or somewhere. Authority is just gone. And I think that for, I don't know, 30 or 40 years, there has been a survivalist instinct, particularly in this country. And those people are ready. And, you know, you see signs of this kind of preparedness. I think it's there in what's been going on in Ottawa, for instance. And, you know, the people who are engaging in that may be people that we deplore and disapprove of. But what we've learned in the last 7 or 8 years in this country is that there are a lot of them, and that they're serious, they're armed, and they're mean. And I don't think it's far-fetched to say that there is going to be some kind of conflict between those people and people like us lined up on our Zoom screen and devoutly believing in American purpose, not just the organization, but American purpose, and hoping for the best and putting on a good face. I think an incredible, appalling struggle is coming. And I might say to my son, do have a child. I give you my blessing. not that you need it, but get ready. And he's smart enough, he knows that. And it's very hard to believe in the idea that it's going to get better. It's much easier to think it's going to get worse. And so it's up to all of us to find a way of dealing with that. And I write books. I mean, that's my escape. And I say in the acknowledgements of this book, and I realized later that this was a kind of shocking thing. I had enormous fun doing this book because writing is the thing that gives me the most fun in life, and it's what keeps me alive, and as well as a lot of people who mean a great deal to me. And Francis Bacon say, I had a very dark view of the world, but I think he got satisfaction, exhilaration even, from painting it. And enough of us looked at the paintings and said, yes, I understand that. I get it. That vision is one I may not inhabit in the way that Bacon does, but I know it. I get it. And that's what art can do. And those of us who are caught up in that have no other option.
I wondered what you thought, if you've seen it, of the Adam McKay film Don't Look Up, which is obviously showing on Netflix at the moment, which in a sense is a sort of cinematic response to all disaster movies by making a film about climate change that's actually, I mean, it's an allegory obviously about a comet about to hit the earth, but that's pretty, it doesn't hold back in its satire of politicians and the inability of politicians to get us out of things, but doesn't really come up with any other great conclusions. I just wondered whether you felt that was a kind of cinematic way of engaging with some of the things that you're talking about.
No, I think it is. And I think that film has found an audience. I mean, there are people who respond to what it's doing. I found it a little disappointing, not quite as good as one or two of Adam McKay's earlier films, but I think that the opportunity for savage satire has never been more evident, and what's happened with Don't Look Up does suggest that there are enough people who would be prepared to see it. I think in a TV series like Succession, it's playing upon the idea, well, just how appalling can these people be? Oh, you think that's the limit? We're going further. And I'm not a huge fan of Succession, but I do see that the show is intended to make us laugh. We're not really involved with these people individually in the way that you might be, but the very worst things that they will do are going to be entertaining because they're funny, I think, and I suspect you're going to get more and more of that. I don't think black humor can go on forever, however,
It seems possibly quite a decadent, well, I don't know, I mean, who knows, kind of response to it. So I suppose what I'm trying to get at is cinema, which obviously is the water in which you have swum for so many years. Do you feel in the end that cinema has been the main contributor towards our current kind of uneasy relationship with not engaging with disaster as real, and then even if we perceive it is, not feeling we can do anything about it? Or do you think it also has helped in some way?
I think it's done both. I find in the last several years, I've been much more interested in asking what has the medium done to us as a whole, as opposed to saying, well, is Scorsese as good as Jean Renoir? Things like that, that kind of question. I find those questions less gripping, but the idea of how the medium may have encouraged us to abandon a sense of responsibility for what we're looking at. That really interests me a lot. And you know, I'm sort of betraying myself in a way, because from the age of 4, I was totally crazy about the movies, and I still am. And my wife and I saw a film this week, The Kindness of Strangers, which probably most people don't heard of. We'd not heard of it, and we saw it and just adored it. And I'm still very open to finding things like that and just falling in love with them. But I do think a case can be made that the movies culturally have done immense harm. And I don't think many of the people whose business it is to do film history and film criticism pay enough attention to that. It's a very, very complicated thing. I saw the first screening of Psycho in London in 1960 in a huge and nearly empty theater. And I was 18, I think. And after the shower sequence, I realized that I was gripping the arms of my seat as if they were a life raft. And I said aloud, if quietly, "Please don't do that again." Totally irrational. As you know, the film had been made. I knew, because I knew enough about Hitchcock to know he would do it again. And I didn't have the strength to get up and walk out because it was too devastating for me. But there I was saying to the medium, "Please don't do that again." And I think that split response for me has always been very important in going to the movies. The first movie I ever saw was Olivier's Henry V. And there is a moment in that film where the French set fire to the English camp and page boys are burned alive. And it was all done with a dissolve. I didn't know what a dissolve was at the age of 4. I thought that I was seeing boys being burned alive. And I howled with grief and pain. And my father, grumbling, had to take me out of the theater. And he took me out into the lobby and said, "Now calm down, boy, calm down. Stop crying. It's just a movie." And I said, "Dad, can we go back and see it, boy?" And, you know, I mean, that's an insanity, just like the crowd shouting with glee at San Andreas. And I think if you're committed to the movies and devoted to them, and if they've shaped your life, you know that split response.
Yeah. And I suppose that is particular to that art form. I suppose there has been nothing quite like that, both knowing that it is real and not real at the same time.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
No, I think that's actually one of the really interesting things about film, that you can read some of the early writings about photography, and people sort of grasp it intellectually, although they are concerned about the capturing of the image. But there is something about the fact that people live over and over again and die over and over again on screen that is really extraordinary, and I think we still can't quite cope with.
Yeah. And you know, the technology again has changed. Once upon a time, you had to sit in front of a screen that was going on like a train. It had a life of its own. You couldn't do anything about it. Now, you could be watching that film, Henry V, on your home screen, and you could play that scene over and over again. And we know very well now that people often do not see films from beginning to end. They know there are scenes they love, and they're often very violent scenes, and they play just that scene. And they will say, they will take out a disc if they've got a disc, or they will stream it, and they'll go for just that scene. And that's done a lot to narrative breaking down, because it's not A, B, C, D anymore. It's just, oh, I love D. I want to see D 10 times tonight. And people do that.
Well, on that slightly depressing thought, it's probably time to bring in some other questions as well. So Jeff, I'm going to hand back to you because you will be you'll be moderating that bit.
Francine, thank you. And David, thank you. That was fabulous. And there's a lot of material to dig into. I'm going to call first on Brent Kalmar to ask first question. And Brent, I know who you are, but maybe not everybody. If you would briefly introduce yourself, and you have the floor.
Thank you. I'm Brent Kalmar. I'm the managing editor of the Journal of Democracy. And at the risk of revealing myself to be one of the people you just described, David, I'd like your thoughts, and Francine's as well, on the legacy of the Odessa step sequence in Battleship Potemkin, because it's one of those scenes that just is absolutely spellbinding. And as a neophyte, as I am, in film, I can't quite say why, aside from the technical virtuosity of it.
It's a scene I talk about in the book, and it's a very good example of our ability to separate style and the technology of style from the meaning. When that film was made, 1925, I think, and for a long time thereafter, it was hailed as a monument of montage, what you could do with editing. And it had a huge influence on how people made films and how people talked about films and wrote about them. And it's an absolutely brilliant sequence. But if you look at it over and over again, as film teachers have, it becomes very cold-blooded. And I think if you watch it enough, you realize that the emphatic nature of the medium is actually on the side of the cruelty of the people marching down the steps. Now, the scene is famous for images and moments of extreme suffering in the civilians who are caught up in it. And Francis Bacon used some of the stills from that film as the basis for some of his paintings. And they are paintings of a scream and of great distress and pain. But there is a power and a momentum in the soldiers marching down, carrying out their will. It's very interesting to play it next to Triumph of the Will, Riefenstahl's film about the Nazi rally. And Riefenstahl and Eisenstein would have said that politically they were antithetical. But the style and the technology of the style, the nature of film editing, actually makes those two scenes quite alike. And it's really interesting to play those two together.
And of course, it goes on down through the generations, isn't it, that you see it constantly referred to either knowingly or unknowingly in later filmmakers that come on, and those same soldiers marching on the steps are also to be found in Star Wars, and there's also a kind of echo of them in Dune as this new, the various iterations of Dune. It's still there. It is still something that we recognize as a kind of powerful, and even though it's not always the loathsome people who look like that, it is sometimes still seen as, sort of admirable, powerful, magnificent in some way.
Yeah. Good question.
Thank you, and thank you, Brent. So we have 15 minutes, and this is not a perfect way to proceed, but here we are. We're going to proceed this way. I'm going to bundle them a little bit, just so that everybody gets, or many people get their voice heard, and as a room, we understand what people are thinking about and reacting to. So let me call on Michael Allen and Lisa Lewis and Sean Keeley. If in each case you introduce yourself and be brief, we'll bundle those three and then give David and Francine a chance to respond. So Michael first. Michael, you have to unmute. I think you're saying technical problem passed for right now. Is that right? I'm trying to, okay. So we'll come back to you, Michael. Lisa, may I call on you, please?
Yes, thank you. It's my pleasure to have heard Mr. Thomson. This is the third event that I've been able to hear him speak, so this is wonderful. You were talking about how modern technology has all of us on our iPhones and we consume information in a new way that's in some ways harmful. And I was thinking about, there was an era when there were things that were very disturbing that, you know, people would talk about snuff films where there were, it's sort of a horrible level of a disaster film idea of actually seeing people actually die on film. And as you were speaking, I couldn't help but think about that the whole world was able to see the George Floyd killing, and we have our iPhones and you almost couldn't escape seeing that. And so in a way, we were seeing this sort of very individual, disturbing disaster film in a way that we all shared whether we wanted to or not. And the thing that you talked about of the desensitization, that we don't feel such strong feelings about violence, but I wonder what your reaction might be in the sense that it seems as if people did have a powerful reaction to fight back against something from viewing something that I think was sort of a collectively experienced disaster. So thank you.
So Lisa, thank you. Despite what I said, I'm going to contradict myself. That's a pretty specific and rich question. Sean, stand by. David and Francine, over to you for a reply.
Well, I mean, obviously the coverage, which was accidental in a way, of what happened to George Floyd had a huge impact. And in history, George Floyd will probably be remembered as someone who had a great impact on our political, racial thinking. However, I think for everything that has got that incredible grip of authenticity, you have to bear in mind also that the footage from, excuse me, from January the 6th at the Capitol, which we've certainly seen over and over again, and is truly terrible. There is already a quite widespread claim that it was fake, or it didn't quite mean what the interpretation has said about it. And that leads us into what I think is it's a very big issue. Once upon a time, the movies were valuable in part because we accepted that they were a record of something that had happened. In a Renoir film, where a man and a woman walk along a riverbank and they pass through fading, changing light, and she puts a hand on his arm, the reality of the situation was integral to what we felt about the film. There was a real relationship between nature and our role as spectator. Computer-generated imagery has taken us away from nature. There is much less nature in our films than used to be the case. And we know that the medium can do anything. Therefore, we do not quite trust it in the same way. And it's part of the whole process whereby once we introduced into our culture the lifelike, the value of life began to recede a little bit. And that's been going on a long time. But, you know, a climax of that, or a high point of that, is a film like San Andreas, where you're seeing something that you know could happen, but isn't happening. And I think films mean less to the public because that relationship with nature is coming apart.
I've very little to add to that, except to say, I think one of the interesting things about the impact of the George Floyd footage, despite the fact obviously it was truly terrible event was actually, it didn't look like screen violence. Screen violence has a kind of choreography and a perfection, and this was clearly real life.
Yeah, no, totally. Although the people there did not really intervene.
No.
You know.
No, they filmed rather than, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
What they did turned out to be very valuable, but I don't know. It's a tricky one. That.
So that makes me want to ask a question, but I won't. So Sean, could you please read my mind and ask the question I wanted to ask? Sean, you have the floor. Tell us who you are.
I don't think it'll be your question, Jeff, but thank you. My name is Sean Healy. I'm a contributing editor at American Purpose, and I'm a graduate student in New York and a big film buff. I wanted to ask you, David, if you consider some of America's great silent comedians as in some way being part of this disaster movie tradition. And the reason I ask is that when I watch someone like Buster Keaton, so much of the appeal is this idea of a man narrowly averting disaster again and again as the world is literally crumbling around him in some ways. And so much of the comedy of the stunt work comes from that sense of escaping disaster. I was just curious if your book touches on that and if you see anything to that interpretation.
The closest I come to it in the book is talking about Laurel and Hardy with this film, The Music Box, where they are attempting to carry a piano in a case up a very big staircase in Los Angeles. The staircase is still there. And it's only a short film. I think it's less than half an hour, but it's a sublime film. But as you're suggesting, it draws upon what was a mainstream in silent comedy, which was people skirting disaster. And Keaton is a great example of it. Harold Lloyd, too. People in incredibly dangerous predicaments managing to come through. And you can take that as a metaphor for hope, I think. But it's also based upon the way the audience loves to see a house falling down, and falling down in such a way that Buster Keaton is standing there, and fortuitously he's where the doorway in the house is, so that he isn't crushed by the house. One of the great moments in his career.
So thank you. I'm looking to see if anybody else, Michael Allen, are you still there? And did you tackle your technical issue? Or are you passing still? Anybody else want to get in? I'm going to ask a quick question while you're thinking. We have 6 minutes to go. David and Francine, as I've taken a lot of notes. You've given us a lot of food for thought. Let me ask you this: if it's too odd or vague, you can pass. Seems to me that a theme of our time, and it comes up indirectly in this conversation today, but David, you started very big picture. A theme of our time is the erosion of trust, voters in politicians, the people in elites, let's say the flock in the church, and women and men, and consumers and capitalism, and so on and so forth. What about the arts and film? What's the responsibility? What's the expectation of us as audiences? And is this pact holding? Or is it unsettled and fluid and dynamic, where people begin to lose confidence in film, the creators, and the writers? David, maybe first, and then Francine.
Well, the first crowds I was in were in movie theaters. And when I was a kid, you had to get to the theater early because you had to queue, as we said, you had to stand in line. You might not get in. I was turned away from theaters sometimes, and these weren't regular theaters such as we know today. These were theaters that held 2,000 or 3,000 people. And I would sit there in a sea of strangers, because I went on my own quite a lot. The air was thick with smoke. I mean, it was an appallingly unhealthy place. But when the movie worked, everybody was working with it. Everyone laughed. Everyone was afraid or excited at the same time. And I never thought about it in these terms or rationalized it, but movie going was a lesson in community. Chaplin wrote about this years earlier, about the excitement of being in a medium that would reach everyone in the world. And Chaplin, in his naive but very earnest way, thought that that might save the world. And you know, in the early days of cinema, people thought the medium had that potential. Everyone would go. And when I say everyone, it's close to everyone used to go. Well, we don't have theaters like that anymore. And we're in a stage now where in San Francisco, for instance, one of the major art house theaters, which had 6 screens, I think, closed suddenly a few weeks ago. The great theater in town, the Castro, is going over to doing live events. Theaters are in retreat. COVID has only stressed the way people like to stay home to watch. And I think the staying home is part of a kind of fear of the world, but I'm not sure people are going to go back to theaters in the way that they ever did before. And that takes away the metaphorical possibility that we see ourselves as a great community. And you know, you can watch something streaming and you can be moved intensely by it. And we've all been there, I think. And we may email a few friends to say, by the way, you ought to see so-and-so. But you don't have that communal sense of being with people, not necessarily people of your type or class, and just going with the film. That was an incredible, exhilarating thing about the movies until television came along, really. It began to crack there. Francine, get in there.
Well, yeah, I wish I could come up with something. I think that communal moment probably has gone, but I think the demand for narrative is as strong as ever. And therefore there will be a place, but it's going to be the way we will learn. I mean, the kindness of strangers has now passed amongst us as a recommendation from you this evening. It will eddy out in sort of smaller ways of talking about things. In a sense, technology is allowing us to do that. So that's good. But I think people will still be, and I'm actually heartened this year in awards season that there are a lot of, independent films getting attention and love. So I think that's a great sign. And we really, really want those stories to kind of make sense. In fact, paradoxically, precisely because of that feeling of disaster, to make kind of sense of what's going on.
Totally, absolutely.
So you all, we are out of time, punctual 1 p.m. Eastern evening in Great Britain. I'm sorry to wrap it up. I'm sorry to those, my apologies, whom I was unable to call on in these last minutes. Please bear with me. Thanks to Luke Phillips and Braver Angels for co-hosting today. Please read, watch, listen to Francine Stock, and please read David's new book, Disaster, Mon Amour. It's fabulous. If I hold it up more or less so you can see it in the screen. And to those who joined today, heartfelt thanks. What a wonderful, marvelous group. And in the spirit of community, if you're in a position to do so, would you switch your cameras on if they're off, just to say hello and good afternoon and good evening. It's nice to see you all. Thank you for switching them on, for your valuable time. And David and Francine, big, big thanks. What a great discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sydney, and everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sydney.
Okay.
Too late.
Thanks, everyone.
Francine, bless
Thank
you.
you, David.
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you so much.
Bye.